Imagine a rule that had survived every World Cup for 56 years, untouched, unbent, unbreakable. Then imagine watching that rule dissolve in less than a week, right after the President of the United States picked up the phone and called the single most powerful man in world football. That is not a hypothetical. That is exactly what just happened at the 2026 World Cup. And it has turned a soccer story into a political story practically overnight. For more than 5 decades, the regulation was simple and absolute. A straight red card in a World Cup match meant an automatic one-game suspension. No appeal, no exceptions, no wiggle room. It did not matter if you were the biggest star on the planet or a reserve player nobody outside your hometown had ever heard of. 12 players had already been sent off earlier in this tournament, and all 12 served their bans without complaint or controversy. That was simply how the sport worked. Then came Fowler and Balogun. The American forward on loan from Monaco and once an Arsenal Academy product had been the breakout story of the co-host nation's World Cup run. He opened the scoring in a 2-0 win over Bosnia and Herzegovina, giving him a goal contribution in every single match he had played in the tournament. Then, midway through the second half of that same game, he went into a challenge with Bosnian defender Tarik Muharemovic and raked his boot down the back of the man's leg. Video review confirmed what officials feared. This was serious foul play, and out came the red card. Was it a harsh call? Almost certainly yes. Head coach Mauricio Pochettino later said something close to 99% of people in the sport viewed the decision as unfair, and plenty of neutral observers agreed the punishment did not match the intent behind the tackle. But harsh red cards happen constantly in professional soccer, and the response has always been the same. You serve the ban. Balogun's suspension under the tournament's disciplinary rules was automatic. He was ruled out of the round of 16 clash with Belgium, and every outlet covering the tournament treated that as settled fact. Then, according to reporting from The Guardian, The New York Times, Politico, and CBS, something extraordinary started happening inside the White House. Andrew Giuliani, who runs the administration's World Cup task force, flagged the red card to President Trump almost immediately. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick was looped in. U.S. soccer officials began working the phones. And according to The Guardian and The New York Times, the president himself made a Wednesday night phone call directly to FIFA President Gianni Infantino, asking him to review the suspension. Reports describe multiple calls placed by Trump to FIFA that week, with Infantino reportedly listening, making no firm promises, but agreeing that the disciplinary committee would take another look. 3 days later, on Sunday, FIFA's disciplinary committee announced its decision. Balogun's one-match ban would be suspended for a full year. He was free to play against Belgium. President Trump posted almost immediately on his social media platform, thanking FIFA for what he called reversing a great injustice. Here is the part that should genuinely surprise anyone who follows this sport. FIFA did not simply overturn the red card or grant a standard appeal because no appeal process even existed for this kind of situation. Instead, the disciplinary committee reached for Article 27 of its disciplinary code, a broad and rarely discussed provision that allows FIFA's judicial bodies to suspend the enforcement of all or part of a punishment. Under this rule, a sanctioned player is placed on probation lasting somewhere between 1 and 4 years. The red card itself remains permanently on Balogun's record, and if he commits a similar offense during his 1-year probationary window, the original ban snaps back into force immediately on top of whatever new punishment follows. According to FIFA's own history, Article 27, previously numbered Article 26 before a 2019 revision, had never once been applied to a sending off at a men's World Cup. Not during the entire span since red and yellow cards were introduced to the tournament back in 1970. Researchers combing through World Cup history could find only one loosely comparable case: Brazilian legend Garrincha in 1962, back when there was no automatic suspension rule at all and disciplinary outcomes were decided case by case through committee discretion. Even that decision, more than 6 decades ago, was clouded by allegations of political interference at the time, a phrase that keeps trailing behind FIFA no matter the era. When journalists at the BBC pressed FIFA for a detailed explanation of why this one player, at this one moment, warranted a rule that had never been used before in tournament history, the response was essentially nothing. No published legal reasoning, no detailed breakdown, which is unusual for a body that typically documents disciplinary rulings. Officials pointed reporters toward an earlier decision involving Cristiano Ronaldo, but that comparison collapses under scrutiny since Ronaldo's red card came during World Cup qualifying, not the tournament itself, and even in that case, FIFA offered some form of explanation. For Balogun, there was largely silence. And silence tends to invite speculation rather than settle it. It matters enormously why FIFA and the White House cared this much about one 25-year-old forward. Balogun is not a bit player on this roster. He is, by every measurable statistic, the engine of the co-host's attack. Heading into the Belgium match, he was the team's leading scorer with 3 goals, and he had generated a direct goal contribution in every single game he had featured in this World Cup. Quick, sharp, comfortable holding the last defensive line, and punishing any hesitation. He is precisely the type of forward who decides tight knockout matches on a single moment of quality. Context matters here too. This American squad, under Pochettino, has been playing arguably its best football of his tenure, chasing a first World Cup quarterfinal appearance since 2002. Just months earlier, in a pre-tournament exhibition match, Belgium had thrashed the co-hosts 5-2, exposing serious defensive vulnerabilities. Since then, everything has shifted, and a huge part of that turnaround traces directly back to Balogun's finishing and movement up front. Remove him from the lineup, and you remove the sharpest edge of an entire attacking system. There is also an emotional layer that made this controversy land differently with American fans than a typical rules dispute might. Many felt Balogun had effectively already paid for his tackle twice over, once by forcing his own team to play more than half an hour a man down against Bosnia, and then again by facing a suspension for the biggest match of the tournament so far. Reports from the locker room described Balogun handling the entire situation with unusual composure, refusing to lash out publicly, talking instead about setting a good example for young fans watching, and calling the whole experience surreal. That measured reaction won him sympathy well beyond the usual pool of American soccer fans, which only intensified the reaction once the suspension was lifted. But sympathy for a player is not the same thing as a legitimate process, and this is where the story turns from a footnote into a genuine institutional crisis for FIFA. Belgium's federation reacted with fury. In an official statement, they said they were, in their own words, astonished, and pointed directly at the regulations FIFA had just bypassed, including a circular notice reportedly sent to every participating federation back in May, explicitly stating that these automatic suspensions could not be avoided. The federation said FIFA had effectively used its own disciplinary code to override the tournament's published rulebook and confirmed they were examining every option available to them up to and including formal complaints. Belgium head coach Rudy Garcia did not hold back either, joking bitterly that at this World Cup, the 5th of July had apparently turned into April Fool's Day, and insisting that his federation was not simply protecting its own team's interests, but, in his words, defending the sport itself. The reaction from television pundits was just as blunt. On the BBC, Wayne Rooney, hardly a commentator known for soft takes on physical challenges, called the decision a disgrace and said FIFA president Gianni Infantino should be ashamed of it. Former England defender Micah Richards argued the year-long suspended ban made a mockery of the entire tournament's disciplinary structure. Over on ITV, Gary Neville summed up the mood in 2 blunt words: "It absolutely stinks." Perhaps the sharpest voice came from England manager Thomas Tuchel, who had just watched his own defender, Jarell Quansah, sent off in a separate match against Mexico, a suspension that will keep Quansah out of England's own quarterfinal. Tuchel's question is the one FIFA still has not answered. If a phone call can erase Balogun's ban, why not Kwanzaa's? Why not any player facing a suspension in a knockout game with everything on the line? The double standard becomes even more glaring when you compare Balogun's case to others from this same tournament. Qatari midfielder Asim Madibo received a 5-match ban this World Cup for a tackle that broke the leg of Canadian midfielder Ismail Kohn, despite a real argument that the injury resulted from a freak accident rather than reckless intent. 5 matches, no reduction, no phone calls on his behalf. Meanwhile, CNN and other outlets noted that Lionel Messi appeared to escape a broadly similar challenge in Argentina's opening match without even receiving a card. The pattern that emerges is not about consistency in how challenges are judged. It increasingly looks like a pattern about who you are, and more specifically, who is willing to call FIFA headquarters directly on your behalf. To be fair, there is a legitimate version of the American argument, and it deserves acknowledgement rather than dismissal. The red card itself probably was too severe for what happened on the pitch. Forcing a team to play more than half an hour shorthanded in a World Cup knockout match already functions as a serious punishment on its own, and there is a reasonable case that international soccer needs a transparent, published appeals process for exactly these kinds of borderline, unlucky dismissals. Pochettino has repeatedly insisted his team is not the villain in this story. And on the narrow question of whether Balogun deserved to lose so much for one clumsy high-speed challenge, he has a defensible point. If FIFA had a clear, consistent, publicly available review mechanism that any federation could invoke under the same conditions, and Balogun's ban had been lifted through that transparent process, this would be an entirely different conversation, likely a minor footnote rather than a full-blown scandal. That is simply not what happened here. Instead, there is a vague clause buried in the disciplinary code, a closed-door committee that will not explain its reasoning, and a documented cluster of phone calls originating from the most powerful government office on the planet. FIFA's own governing statutes explicitly prohibit political interference in football decisions. Yet FIFA's ethics committee had already been examining questions about Infantino's unusually close relationship with President Trump, including the widely publicized moment when FIFA awarded Trump a peace prize earlier in his term. The two men have cultivated a multi-year friendship, with Infantino becoming a frequent presence at White House events. They are scheduled to appear together to jointly present the World Cup trophy on the 19th of July. An image that will now be viewed through an entirely different lens, given everything that has unfolded in the days leading up to it. None of this necessarily requires a grand conspiracy theory to be troubling. When the host nation's most productive attacker receives the benefit of a never-before-used disciplinary provision just days after a sitting American president personally lobbied the head of world football, and the organization then declines to explain its reasoning, skepticism does not require paranoia. It simply requires paying attention. The lasting damage here may be less about one suspended ban and more about what it signals going forward. Even if it turns out the phone calls changed nothing at all, and the disciplinary committee would have reached an identical conclusion entirely on its own, the appearance alone is corrosive to the sport's credibility. From this point forward, every controversial red card for the remainder of the tournament carries an implicit question mark. Would this suspension have held up if the right person had made a call? A deep American run through the knockout stage now arrives with a footnote it never should have needed, regardless of how the team performs on the field. The precedent extends well beyond a single match in Seattle. If a fundamental rule, untouched for 56 years, can bend for one government's intervention, what realistically stops the next head of state from attempting the exact same maneuver during a future tournament hosted, even partially, on their soil? FIFA had spent much of this World Cup enjoying unusually positive coverage, praised for smooth logistics and strong attendance across host cities in the United States, Mexico, and Canada. In one weekend, over one disciplinary ruling involving one player, the organization traded a significant amount of that accumulated goodwill for what looks to a large segment of the football world. like a political favor. The regulations technically did not change this past Sunday. They simply stopped applying evenly to everyone involved in the tournament. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem, because a rule that bends for the right phone call is not really a rule in any meaningful sense anymore. It is a suggestion, applied selectively, and selective enforcement is precisely the kind of crack that erodes public trust in a sporting institution over time, even if the immediate consequences seem limited to one match involving one striker. As kickoff approaches for the United States and Belgium in Seattle with a World Cup quarterfinal spot on the line, the football conversation and the political conversation have become almost impossible to separate. Belgium's federation has confirmed it is weighing its response and reviewing every available option under FIFA's own governance framework, language that suggests this dispute is far from finished regardless of Monday's result on the scoreboard. Multiple European federations are reportedly watching closely as well, aware that the precedent set here could resurface the next time one of their own players faces a red card in a must-win knockout match. Whatever happens on the pitch tonight, the deeper story is unlikely to fade quickly. FIFA's ethics committee reviews, Belgium's federation complaint, and the broader question of Infantino's relationship with the Trump administration are all expected to generate continued coverage well past the final whistle. For a tournament that FIFA hoped would be remembered primarily for record attendance and thrilling knockout football across 3 host nations, it now risks being remembered just as much for the moment a 56-year-old rule quietly stopped applying to everyone equally. The timing of all this could hardly be more sensitive for FIFA, given how heavily the organization has leaned on its partnership with the United States government to help stage this expanded 48-team World Cup across 3 countries. Hosting rights negotiations, stadium security coordination, and visa arrangements for traveling fans all depend heavily on cooperation between FIFA and the White House task force that Andrew Giuliani has been running since well before the tournament kicked off. That task force was originally created to smooth logistics, handle security concerns, and coordinate between federal agencies and host cities. Its direct involvement in a single disciplinary ruling for one player represents a significant expansion of its apparent role, and critics argue it blurs a line that should never have been blurred in the first place. It is also worth remembering how unusual it is for a sitting American president to involve himself this directly in the internal workings of an international sports federation. Previous administrations have occasionally offered public congratulations or attended matches as guests, but reporters covering FIFA for years say they cannot recall a comparable instance of a head of state placing multiple personal calls to lobby for a specific disciplinary outcome involving one athlete. That novelty alone has kept this story circulating across political outlets as much as sports outlets, with commentators on both sides of the aisle weighing in on whether this represents an appropriate use of presidential influence or a troubling overreach into an organization that insists, at least on paper, that it operates independently of any single government. Some American commentators have pushed back against the framing of this as pure political interference, arguing instead that Trump was simply advocating loudly for a call that many neutral soccer analysts already believed was excessive in the first place. Under this reading, the phone calls were less a demand for special treatment and more a high-profile version of what fans and pundits do every week when they complain about referee decisions on social media, except with far more reach and far more institutional weight behind it. Whether that distinction meaningfully changes the ethical calculation is exactly the kind of question that FIFA's own ethics committee will likely be forced to address in the coming weeks, particularly if Belgium follows through on threats to escalate their complaint formally. Belgium's own World Cup run has not been without its share of fortunate breaks either, which some observers have noted adds an extra layer of irony to their outrage. The Red Devils needed extra time and a contentious, deep stoppage time penalty decision to eliminate Senegal in the previous round, overcoming a 2-goal deficit along the way. That context has not stopped Belgian officials from framing their objection as a matter of principle rather than self-interest, insisting repeatedly that the complaint is about protecting the integrity of the disciplinary system for every federation, not simply about denying the co-hosts their best forward for one match. Meanwhile, FIFA's disciplinary committee has offered no indication that it plans to revisit or clarify its reasoning beyond the brief statement issued on Sunday. That silence has left plenty of room for outside legal analysts to speculate about how Article 27 might be invoked again before the tournament concludes, and whether other federations emboldened by this precedent might now attempt similar appeals through back-channel political pressure rather than the sport's normal disciplinary procedures. Several European football associations are reportedly already discussing internally whether they should raise formal questions with FIFA about the criteria used to grant this kind of suspended sanction, seeking clarity before the quarterfinal and semifinal rounds produce their own contentious red cards. For now, the match itself remains the most immediate flashpoint. Balogun stepping onto the field in Seattle carries a different weight than it would have just a week earlier, not because of anything he personally did wrong beyond the original tackle, but because of everything that happened around him in the days since. Every commentator calling the match is expected to reference the controversy repeatedly throughout the broadcast, and neutral fans watching from outside the United States say the storyline has already overshadowed much of the pure sporting narrative, heading into one of the tournament's most anticipated knockout fixtures. Whatever the final score turns out to be, this episode has already reshaped how casual fans and dedicated analysts alike will view disciplinary decisions for the remainder of this World Cup. Trust, once visibly shaken in a sporting institution, rarely rebuilds quickly, and FIFA now faces the challenge of proving through its next several rulings that Article 27 was not simply a convenient tool reserved for the tournament's most politically connected host nation,